Hi, I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Donald.
And we're in mixed company. So hi. How are you, Don?
I'm pretty good, actually. How you doing today?
I'm okay. A little nervous.
Well, of course. This is our first podcast.
Podcast and everything.
Yeah, we've never done this before.
I know, but that's okay. We'll make it happen.
Right.
This is where the magic begins.
Ooh.
So you are tuned into In Mixed Company, and I'll give you a little bit about myself. I'm Stephanie Bass. I live in Canada. I'm biracial. I'm an educator. And I'm very active in the anti-racism movement up here. Yes, there is racism in Canada.
Also below the border.
Yeah. And with me is my favorite partner in crime, Donald. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
All right. Well, I'm Donald Montgomery. I am not biracial. I'm a white guy. I'm a public servant. I am very happy to be here with Stephanie. Also very happy that she's my partner. And yeah, it's just basically, we're going to be talking a lot about what makes us work, what struggles we have, and all that type of stuff.
What struggles I have?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I experience those struggles by watching what you go through. I mean, nobody bothers me, so
yeah,
that's a little different.
All right, so I guess we'll talk a little bit about what this podcast is, since this is the introduction episode. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So the podcast is called In Mixed Company, which is very purposeful because there's two reasons for the podcast. One is I want to look at multiracial identities, so people who are sort of mixed race like I am, and what that means for their relationships, not only with other people of other races, but the relationship to racism and stuff like that. But I also, the title's kind of twofold. It's like a non-sexual double entendre, and that I didn't know how else to explain it.
Sorry, I started laughing.
Because I also want to talk about race and racism in politics, like in mixed company, and what that means racially is in groups of people that aren't the same race, because I had a lot of struggles with that, especially when trying to talk to white people about racism in my sort of experiences. Do you think that that's reasonable?
I mean, of course it's reasonable. I mean, the thing is that, coming at it from the other angle, I'm like a white man between the ages of 25 and 40, as Homer Simpson would say. Everybody listens to me. Doesn't matter what I'm saying. It doesn't matter how dumb my words are. I try to be informed. I try to be sort of, like understanding, and I always reach out and sort of try to see things from another perspective. But at the same time, us white folks tend to be a little bit sensitive, a little bit oversensitive, I think, whenever we're sort of, what do you want to call it?
I don't know if the word sensitive is right.
Defensive.
Maybe defensive.
Back goes up whenever someone calls us on something. But
that's not what this podcast is for. This podcast is hopefully to make people feel comfortable in talking about race, because I think it's something that we need to really come to terms with.
Yeah, I mean,
especially across sort of racial divides.
Well, of course. I mean, the idea is, get through the initial discomfort, help people see that it doesn't have to be uncomfortable, that it's just about, sort of celebrating the different differences and stuff.
So what do you think about that discomfort? I remember, because you have sort of been an anti-racist for a while now.
Yeah, a few years.
So, I mean, what is that discomfort like? Like, do you still feel it when people are talking about, like, white privilege or something like that? Do you still feel that discomfort?
Personally, no. I don't feel bad when someone's like if for example I'm watching a person of color or listening to a person of color speak about how white privilege affects their experience and stuff like that in a negative way.
Well, I don't think white privilege would affect them. I think racism would affect them, and white privilege is sort of the other side of that. It's like if you're not the person doing the racism, for lack of a better term, like
Yeah.
that you still sort of have a role in it.
Yeah. So what I meant, or what I was trying to say, is that whenever, someone is talking about racism, and, one of the aspects of racism is that white privilege. I'm not uncomfortable when someone calls that out, when someone talks about it, when someone says that that's sort of part of the problem. Because
Is that because I wake you up every morning saying, hey, get up, time to face your white privilege?
Well, number one, you actually don't do that. I mean,
think
that would be hilarious.
I think I should start.
I mean, that would be so funny. But no, it's not that. It's the fact that I recognize everybody should be equally valuable. And when we create systems that fight that or prevent that, that bothers me.
But that is what racism is, right?
Absolutely.
That's the system that is putting sort of the hierarchy on race and the value on certain people's lives over others, right?
Yeah, I know, it sucks.
Which is a problem.
Yeah.
Which is really problematic for somebody like me because I'm part of both of those worlds, right? Like I get to be oppressor and oppressed at the same time.
Yeah, I mean...
But I never feel like the oppressor.
Well, that's because the oppressor does not recognize you as...
part of the oppressor.
There you go.
Oppressoration.
Yeah, that's not a word.
The oppressive empire.
The machine!
Part of the man.
There you go. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, ultimately, you're always going to be other, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that's what makes, like, being somebody who is multiracial or mixed race or biracial or however you identify, I think that it makes it really frustrating because I do align more with being black than I do with being white, but I really think that that's a product sort of my upbringing more than anything else because we only really talk to my father's side of the family, which was black, so I've always just identified with them. And there's actually, I know this is terrible, but College Humor has like a video that's very poignant about mixed races, and they have like this court of how Asian somebody is, and so the person's like, my great grandmother was Korean, and so he's like, oh well, you're 1/16 Asian, that's not even Asian, and the judges were somebody who was full Asian, half Asian, and quarter Asian, and then they had to clean up for the next court, for the black court. And then when that person came in, she's like, my grandmother was black. And then all three people went, you're black.
That sounds about right.
So the idea of like creating like this hierarchy, but like if you're somewhat black, especially in the American context, because that's where my family's from, like if you're half black, no, you're black.
Well, yeah, didn't it go all the way down to like 64th?
I don't know. We'll look at that up for another episode. But
yeah,
the idea that even if you're a little bit black, you're black, but that's not necessarily the experience for people of other mixed races, right? Like,
yeah,
and what that means. And so, like, part of I think the difficulty is that there's like, not that there's a universal black experience or a universal white experience, but I think that there's no two multiracial people will have sort of the same experience. I had a really good friend who was also biracial, black and white, and she grew up in Canada in an all-white neighborhood. And so she never really identified with being black.
Right.
Which is interesting, right? Because she was really young and she wouldn't have picked up on sort of the nuances of racism and how that works as a system.
Right.
But we were the same sort of shade, even like we were pretty light-skinned, but we had enough characteristics that you could tell that we were mixed with something. And it's just because, you know, my family in North Carolina and her family in Canada, We just identified with the people we were around the most.
Yeah, and so just out of curiosity, as she got older, I'm assuming she sort of started noticing those
Yeah,
nuances.
she did.
And then what happened? Did she start? Did she still identify the same way, or did she change her?
I think the really good thing about her is she was pretty authentic. So she recognized that she actually couldn't just identify as white because people didn't let her.
Yeah.
For example, like they're like, well, you're also half black, right? Like, so that sort of genealogy guessing game that happens when you're a mixed race person. I think actually, you know what we should do that would be really helpful? We should do some definitions.
Oh, that's
so
a good
what
idea.
we mean by like race or racism, because racism is pretty contested, it's pretty debated as something.
You'll find, and the worst part is you'll find people out there who believe that it's either non-existent or against white people kind of thing, and that's not.
I don't think people think
works.
it's non-existent. I just think people think it's like a pendulum.
Yeah.
That swings, and it's not really like that. So I'll tell you what I think racism is, okay? So I think racism is a system. It's a system that values one race over another, and that system is implicated in every sort of part of societal life. So you can have something that is a systemic sort of racism, and that's like large systems like law and education, and how there's racism embedded in that. I'll give you an example in education. For example, like Canadian history books. American history books are a little better, but Canadian history books for the longest time didn't have a lot of information about the experiences of Canadians who weren't of English or French descent, right? And Canada has a huge long history of multicultural immigration. So example, a large amount of Chinese immigrants that came in and built the railway, the United Black Empire Loyalists that came in from the slave states in the South. For a long time, those stories were omitted, right? And I remember when I learned history that I didn't learn a lot about that in Canadian schools. And so that's one type of racism, this sort of systemic, overreaching, not in your face, overt sort of racism. And I always think that's the hardest one to convince people about.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not hard to convince someone that racism is a problem when someone is screaming offensive words or, holding up a sign, or, we just recently saw what happened in Toronto with that guy who's holding up the Islamophobic sign, and you were telling me that he got thrown in a fountain, which I think, frankly, he deserved. But
why do you think he deserved that? Because there's a lot of people that think, oh, violence isn't the answer.
Well, I mean, ultimately, my views have definitely sort of evolved, obviously, and I think the thing is that once, if you grow up, I grew up on Prince Edward Island. There's, it's very monochromatic, it's very white. There is an indigenous population there. There's a few black people. At least when I was a kid, there were a few black people that I met.
Really? On PEI?
Yeah, Dr. Manigani. Remember her?
That's one person.
Yeah, and her family.
Okay.
So, there's plurality there. But also, for example, my dad, he is a doctor, and he worked on the reservation every Wednesday. And so I would go to the reservation and play.
The reservation, that's an island.
Yeah, Lennox Island. Not a great place. Not because, it's just... A lot of the reservations were built on land that no one else wanted. So,
yeah, it's not. It's yeah.
That sucks. So
you're not disparaging indigenous peoples.
No, I'm not at all. But yeah, I would go and play with the kids there, and I never understood why people thought they were different. But then I was also a child, so I didn't care. I was just like, oh, there's a ball, let's play, or oh, there's a field, let's go run around or play tag or whatever. So, I was lucky that way in that I was exposed young, but I also never really thought about it because almost my entire existence up until I went to university, I could count on one hand the number of people that I had regular interactions with who weren't white.
Yeah, I think that's part of systemic as well, like the idea of not ghettoization, but the idea that different communities have differing levels of diversity, right? Like if you live in a city, you're more likely to live in a more diverse place than if you live in the little island of PEI, right? Where
Yes.
there's one black person and her family. And they put all the indigenous people on an island.
Yes.
I think that you didn't like that.
Well, no, I mean
characterization?
it's kind of it's sad, but it's true. So it's like yeah.
And so that's really systemic, though, right? Like telling people where they can and can't live,
Yeah.
but not really telling them. It's just a practice that has been accepted, right?
Right. And I
And-
mean, then there's also the idea of not, if you're indigenous and you choose to leave that reservation and live elsewhere,
Yeah, you get penalized for that,
you
right?
get penalized. So that's
But
that's overt.
That's not overt. It's systemic, right? Because people are like, well, they have the choice, right? Well, it's
That's
not
true.
really much of a choice.
Yeah, give up all your
You know, like then it's not even like perks. It's like the land was stolen from people, which we'll talk about later in the podcast. But the idea of this sort of systemic racism that functions insidiously,
yeah.
not invisibly, because people see it, not everybody, but it's more insidious because it's just part of how everything is, right? So I see that as one part of racism. I see another racism sort of like as an interpersonal play, like the way that people treat each other. So I think that this is the racism that most people can identify. Like when I walked into a Starbucks and some guy called me a monkey.
Yeah.
Or, like those things are like when
Yeah.
those three skinheads beat me up. Like,
Or when like the guy yelled at you and threw something out the window.
yeah, he called me a terrorist and threw a milkshake at me from a moving car. Like, that's the more overt racism that I think people would identify as racism.
But
And people would like abhor and say, "Oh, that's terrible."
yeah, but you've also
It is terrible.
You've also said, though, that, you've in those situations, people have seen and heard and watched, and they've done nothing. So, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, but I don't think that the people that had seen and watched, I don't think they would say, "Oh, that's okay that he did that." Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think that I got mad
Right.
because nobody came to help me.
Yeah.
But I also think that people either are at a loss or are afraid
Yeah.
for their own safety, right? Like,
Well, that's true. That's very true. If you got three skinheads who are, men, young,
yeah,
wearing certain clothes and looking rough,
cowards.
that's going to be pretty rough.
I'm still mad about that one.
Well, and you should be, because that was horrible.
But no, but like that's the sort of interpersonal, like overt
Yeah.
racism that I think everybody
Knows.
would say that's awful.
Yeah.
Don't do that. But I don't think it's enough just to be against that one type of racism. I think you have to be against all of it. And I think that racism as sort of a broad scoping system is the way I like to look at it. I don't like to look at individual people as being quote unquote racist. I see them as participating in sort of a racist system that was not created by the people that are here right now on
Yeah.
the planet, right?
Yeah, it's an inheritance from...
Yeah. And so we sort of inherited it, and it's all that we know. So it could be...
And people are afraid of change. Like, they're uncomfortable
Yeah.
with change on a
Well,
massive
I don't think
scale.
people know what it's going to look like, right? Like, what is it going to look like if everybody's equal,
Yeah.
right? So
You know,
I would guess it's going to look good.
well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, here's the thing from my perspective. And this goes back to part of the reason why I was saying that, my views have evolved, and I think that guy deserved to be thrown into the fountain. It's because, so that's an overt statement, so and overt statements generally are
I
aggressive.
think you should explain the story. So there was a shooting in Toronto where two young girls, an 18-year-old and a 10-year-old, were killed. And the man who did it had a very brown person, Muslim sounding name.
Right.
And I don't really know much about him.
Yeah,
But unfortunately, it sort of turned into what it always turns into, and this guy was a terrorist, and this is what happens when you bring Muslims into Canada. And so there was a man at the memorial site who had a sign that said, CBC brings you little mosque on the prairie, and then two young girls dead.
Yeah.
And he was holding it at the memorial site, which was at a park on the Danforth. And then somebody, after a confrontation, threw him into the fountain.
Right.
I shouldn't laugh, but...
Well, I mean, the thing is that everything that's come out about the shooting, because I did read up a little bit about it, and the police have been very clear about this, and the family has been very clear about this, and all the reporting, actually, other than maybe a few conservative sites, have been very clear about this, and that is, this guy was not a radicalized person. He was mentally ill, and it's documented.
But it's interesting that if the shooters are white, they're always mentally ill, but if they're not...
Yeah, exactly.
Then there's something else at play.
Well, and if this guy, and that's the thing, if this guy had been white and he had that same medical history, you better believe everybody would be saying, "Oh my goodness, why didn't he get the mental help? Why didn't he get the treatment?" And da da da. And the thing is that this guy,
which stands for this guy that is dead now, right? Why didn't he get the mental health help?
It's the same thing, but because he was not white and because he had a Muslim name, he is now, the subject of these types of attacks. Mm-hmm. And so I think when people know... I
don't even know if it's a Muslim name. It's the name of a king.
That's true. Yeah, I don't know if his family was practicing or not.
I don't know either. We don't even really know what that is. But it's just... I was really sort of interested in... I read the comments.
Oh, you shouldn't have done that. Shouldn't have done that. Oh my goodness.
I read the comments, and there was a large percentage of people that were upset about the use of quote unquote violence. I mean, he wasn't punched; he was pushed into a fountain. But the use of violence against that man with the Islamophobic, and I mean,
well, I remember reading really recently, actually, something interesting.
Well, okay, let me finish my thought though, because I'm not convinced that it was a bad action. I mean, I don't know. Part of me is good, throw him in the fountain. And the other part of me is well, I don't want to be thrown in a fountain when I'm talking about anti-racism stuff. I
think the thing is that, and this is sort of, goes back to what I read recently about the tolerating or the tolerance paradox, which is if you tolerate intolerance, intolerance wins.
Oh, that's a good point.
It's a really interesting thing. So even if you just Google it and look it up, and read up on it, it really talks about how intolerant views, hate-based views, mm-hmm. are actually made stronger by the sort of strategic application of free speech. So in other words, if you're allowed to be a hateful human being and you're active against a certain group because of whatever reason, mm-hmm. If the society that you're a part of allows that, it actually undermines the sort of acceptance narrative or the acceptance ideal, and it strengthens the voices of those who are actively trying to propagate hate.
Yeah, I guess that's true. So, I mean, which is why I think my first instinct was to laugh at this guy being pushed into the fountain.
Well, it also never happens, right?
But I do think that there's something you can't just accept.
Yeah, you have to act.
Yeah, you can't just accept that action doesn't always have to be violent.
No, I mean, there could have been other things, but I think the thing is that we weren't there, so we don't know what was said. And chances are whoever did the pushing was so fed up with whatever this guy was doing and saying and mm-hmm. being. Because basically that person inserted himself into a space where he really had no business being. Mm-hmm. I mean, he could protest wherever, but he chose that specific spot, and he chose that specific spot to be openly... that specific spot to be openly hostile.
Yeah.
And then people had a reaction to that, and they're just like, this isn't the time or place. You can have your beliefs, but go away.
Yeah. And
he didn't do that, so they made him go away.
Yeah. I guess that's true. And so I guess that's our definition of racism. We kind of went off on a tangent.
That's the whole point, right? I mean, if it was so clear cut, we would have a 30-minute podcast once.
Yeah. I think that these are sort of examples of how racism plays. Like that guy with his sign is very much an overt, like interpersonal type of racism displayed. But the fact that, you know what, he won't be arrested or anything, there's no consequences
Yeah.
for having that hate speech is sort of an example of the wider systemic racism, right?
Yeah. And for example, if the person who did the pushing ends up being charged with assault or something like that, there's also that, because then there will be a consequence for the person who said no.
Who didn't tolerate that hate. And so there's which again is sort of the systemic way that racism can propagate, which is a little depressing.
Yeah,
but I mean, he got pushed into a fountain, and that was funny.
Yeah, so I mean, positive, silver lining, I guess.
I don't know.
Anyway,
don't push people in fountains.
No, don't do that. We're not advocating for any of that.
I guess you got to say that.
Okay, so what about going into sort of a little bit like, who do you think this podcast is for? Who's going to like this podcast?
Liberals. No, I think that like liberal people, little L, not capital L. I think that this podcast is probably for people who are interested in talking about race, or if you have questions about racism, you have questions about how to have those discussions.
Or if you want to share your story too, or your experience.
Or people who want to share their stories or their experiences. I do want to talk about sort of biracial and multiracial identity. So if you happen to be multiracial, which I think is pretty much almost everybody on the planet, but not everybody identifies as sort of multiracial.
It's not always visible.
Yeah. I think if you are a person and you know and talk to other people, that you would like this podcast.
That's awesome, because that's legitimately like 99% of the planet. Yeah. So
I mean, if you're a person and you don't like talking to other people,
you still might like it.
Then you're probably me.
Yeah, but you still might like it. I mean, it's not just people who talk, it's people who are interested in the interaction of different people, different cultures, different experiences, different races, whatever.
Yeah.
There's going to be something here. I think it's the ones who are either afraid of that or angry about it.
Yeah.
That are, this is not for you.
Oh, I fully expect to have haters.
Yeah, and
I fully expect people to not always agree with what I say, and that's okay.
Right.
I think that that's fine. I just think that if people are willing to sort of have an open mind, and are willing to listen to somebody else's point of view, that would be something that you'd be interested in.
Right. Do you want to talk about the blog and email address?
We're online on social media. The podcast blog is http://imcpodcast@blogspot.com. And if we have any multimedia or questions, like what I'll do for this episode is I'll put up the news story about the fountain guy.
Yeah.
And you could find the podcasts also there. We have a Facebook page. If you go onto Facebook and put IMC Podcast. We have Twitter. You could tweet at us at IMC Podcast. And if you want to email us with any stories or letters, you could email us at our podcast address, which is InMixedCo Podcast. That's INMIXEDCO Podcast @gmail.com. And I would love to get some emails. That would be great.
Yes, emails from other than Google welcoming us to Gmail.
We got a Twitter one too.
Hooray! Yay, Twitter.
So I guess then what we're going to do next is I think we'll look deeper at like definitions and stuff like that, like, and maybe be a little more on topic about defining like race and the history of race and what racism is and looks like, maybe a little more on topic than we were this time.
Yeah, I mean, like, come up with a list of words and definitions. We can share that on the blog as well. We can talk about it. I don't think that people are going to love a dictionary reading session.
What?
Can you imagine that?
But like just giving different examples and stuff like that.
Of course. Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, thanks for talking with me today, Don.
Yes, and thank you for having me around.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to In Mixed Company podcast, and we'll hope to see you next week.